Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Okay, let's take a moment. You know what to do. Silence your cell phones, please. And note the exits from the room to your right and left and behind you. So tonight is a night for a world premiere. New Canaan Library is delighted to be the place where talented students from the Juilliard School of Music will debut an innovative new program that they've called Narrative Resonance. Here's the idea. They match a piece of classical chamber music with a piece of literature, and then they explore the parallels between the two. For their inaugural program, we'll be learning in what ways 19th century German composer Robert Schumann's Third String Quartet mirrors 20th century English author Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. If you're familiar with Schumann and Woolf, great. If you're not, that's okay. This is for beginners too. We'll be hearing bits of lecture with bits of music, culminating at the end with a full performance of Schumann's String Quartet No. 3. We're grateful to the members of the Neela String Quartet who made the trip from New York City tonight on the train. Vibha Janakiraman, violin, Blues Zhang, violin, Janice Leung, viola, and Nathan Francisco, cello. And now, let's please welcome them and enjoy.
All right, can everybody hear me? It is so lovely to see you all here today, and thank you, Mickey, for such a beautiful, beautiful introduction. This, as she mentioned, is our first event of about 10 or 11 that we have scheduled this year at various libraries and bookstores, art galleries, and schools in the general area. And I want to first take a moment to thank you and thank the library and all of you who are here today, because as this is our first event, it means a lot that it's at a venue whose values align so deeply with what we believe in as artists. And just thank you for placing your trust in us to deliver something that's hopefully meaningful for all of you today. So we're going to talk a little bit about Virginia Woolf, who was a British essayist and novelist who lived from 1882 to 1941, and then the German composer Robert Schumann, who lived between 1810 and 1856. Now, as you hear those dates, you might be wondering, there's no overlap at all between these sets of two dates. These two artists were not contemporaries of one another. Neither wrote explicitly about the other. So how are we sitting here on the stage today telling you that we're going to present you something about the parallels about them? So before we get into the bulk of that, I wanted to look at a couple quotes together that I think, are in service of our mission. So this first one is by the famous conductor Leonard Bernstein, who says, "A work of art does not answer questions, it provokes them. And its essential meaning is in the tension between the contradictory answers." And then another quote, "Every work of art, even though it is produced by following an explicit or implicit poetics, is effectively open to a virtually unlimited range of possible readings, each of which causes the work to acquire new vitality in terms of one particular taste or perspective or personal performance. The work of art has its true being in the fact that it becomes an experience that changes the person who experiences it. Every work of art, even when it is reproduced, as we do so often with these pieces of music that we play over and over again, is a unique phenomenon of presentation. The presentation is not something that happens in addition to the work. Rather, it is the coming into being of the work itself." So I think all three of these quotes speak to the idea that Once a work of art is completed, even though the creator's work is done, whether it's a composer or an author or a painter, the work of art itself stays open. It's still evolving. It's still in the process of being made through the fact that you're all sitting here today experiencing it, through the fact that we're interpreting it, through the fact that we're asking questions about it and bringing new perspectives to it. So neither of these works, the Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse or Schumann's Third Quartet, neither of them are about the other, historically, but the question we're asking is, what can we observe about them today that might each illuminate something about the other? So I invite all of you to join us in this process of questioning rather than looking for one definitive way of looking at either of these two pieces. And we'll explore these questions together. So a little bit of background on Woolf and her connection to music. She was not a musician, but this is a letter that she wrote in 1940 to a dear friend of hers, Elizabeth Trevelyan. And in this letter, she says, "I always think of my books as music before I write them, and especially with The Life of Roger," which is a biography that she wrote about a dear friend. "There was such a mass of detail that the only way I could hold it together was by abstracting it into themes. I did try to state them in the first chapter and then to bring in developments and variations, and then to make them all heard together and end by bringing back the first theme in the last chapter." She later goes on in this letter to say that so many things had to be muted or only hinted. So those of you who are music lovers in any way might already be recognizing some of the parallels here. This idea of themes that we have in music, themes might be one melody, it might be one rhythmic figure, one melodic figure that's very short, that keeps recurring. And most classical music is built around the idea of taking one theme and developing it further. That could look like making small changes to the way it's presented. It could be adding elements, removing elements. But this idea of taking a theme and developing it is sort of the crux of what this music does. And the idea of a theme and variations is actually very explicitly one of the many forms that is used. So keep that in the back of your mind, because we will be returning to that later, as one of the four movements of the Schumann quartet is in this theme and variations form. So we will return to that. So just as a broad introduction to The Lighthouse, in case, for anyone who has not read it, you don't really need to know in Woolf's terms, the massive detail that is the minutia of the plot. But just as a brief overview, it's in 3 sections. The first and the last section only take the span of like one afternoon or one evening each. Time moves very slowly. And what we have instead is the inner workings of each character's perspective. We have many different shifts of perspective. And we see each character reacting to their own lived experience as they're hearing what other characters are saying, as they're thinking about the things that they're battling internally, as they're thinking about their wants, their needs, their desires, their curiosities. And it follows the Ramsey family, who's vacationing at their summer home, while Lily Briscoe, who we hear from a lot in this book, is a young painter working on a portrait of Mrs. Ramsey. In the evening, they all gather for a dinner. They invite several guests who all have there's quite a number of rather eccentric characters who come to this dinner. And what we see in this dinner, though nothing explicit happens, there's no big juncture, there's no big central conflict, there's no moment that the entire plot builds to where there's a reckoning of multiple characters or a reckoning of any kind of conflict in one individual character's story. Nothing particularly happens. And yet we feel like we've lived a sort of rich emotional life with these characters because we see this inner world of each character, their feelings, their fears, a lot of their observations of other characters. And even though nothing dramatic occurs, all of these little moments are deeply felt, and often reactions to what the other characters are doing or saying or not doing are also deeply felt and deeply experienced, if not, reacted to externally. And in some ways, I think that's quite reflective of what it feels like for most of us to go through life. It's not that every day there are sort of dramatic occurrences, but it's this accumulation of little moments that we feel and experience deeply. So this brings us to a discussion of what narrative looks like in works of art. One of the narrative structures that we are used to seeing is this sort of arc-like structure where we have a beginning, a presentation of our setting, and then a rising energy, and then a big climax, and then a falling away and a closing. That's something we're very much used to in a lot of literature and in a lot of classical music. That's the structure we see. But what Virginia Woolf starts to do by focusing on these inner moments, the inner moments and the inner worlds of these characters, is instead of this, she has something that's a little bit more horizontal. And within that horizontal structure, we have sort of little loops where we're experiencing these moments that gather together in wave-like currents. And that's how we move from beginning to end. So rather than this narrative structure being kind of like a container which the plot fills into, the narrative or the story is built bit by bit through these little moments. A helpful analogy for me is to think about drawing a square. There are a couple of ways we can do this. We can draw an outline of the square and shade it in with our color of choice. Or we can begin by shading and shade in this shape so that by the time we finish shading and we step back and look at what we've drawn, what emerges is the shape of a square. And we have a square in both pictures, but the approach to getting there is radically different. So that's one way to think about this relationship between the narrative arc and the story that's within it. So as a continuation of this, these are not words from Woolf herself, but this is from academic writing about her. We can see that she has this politicized notion of narrative structure, which is what I just mentioned. We're sort of turning traditional narrative on its head in favor of this little moments approach, this expression of life just going on. And yes, she's decentralizing the narrative drive of writing. And she was really familiar with actually the string quartet genre. She loved Beethoven's string quartets, especially his late string quartets. I believe pretty early into her career, she attended a full performance of all 17 of Beethoven's quartets. And this was something that was, always on in her household. She lived with this music. And I think the string quartet as a genre was one that was very dear to her because of that. So again, this idea of an ongoing interrelational life between the characters that's at times fragmented and disconnected, that's something that is sort of uniquely able to be presented by music. If we think back to the letter that we saw, she talks about things being muted, only hinted. Because music out of the art forms is in some way least connected to tangible depictions, like words or paintings, they depict things that we can actually see out in the world. Because music has that unique position, it most easily is able to do this kind of hinting, showing, not telling, is maybe one way to think about it. And I think that is very conducive to this idea of inner worlds that she's trying to explore. So maybe that's why she felt this connection so strongly. So let's now look at some examples from To the Lighthouse. We'll look at a couple examples of text that sort of show us this, what we call a stream of consciousness style, where we're looking at moments of life going on. And we're going to have Nathan read a couple of excerpts for us.
As usual, Lily thought. There was always something that had to be done at that precise moment, something that Mrs. Ramsay had decided, for reasons of her own, to do instantly. It might be with everyone standing about making jokes, as now not being able to decide whether they were going into the smoking room, into the drawing room, up to the attics. Then one saw Mrs. Ramsay in the midst of this hubbub, standing there with Minta's arm in hers, bethink her, yes, it is time for that now. And so make off at once with an air of secrecy to do something alone. And directly she went, with a sort of disintegration set in. They wavered about, went different ways. Mr. Banks took Charles Tansley by the arm and went off to finish on the terrace the discussion they had begun at dinner about politics, thus giving a turn to the whole poise of the evening, making the weight fall in a different direction, as if, Lily thought, seeing them go, and hearing a word or two about the policy of the Labour Party, they had gone up onto the bridge of the ship and they were taking their bearings. The change from poetry to politics struck her like that. So Mr. Banks and Charles Tansley went off, while the others stood there looking at Mrs. Ramsay going upstairs in the lamplight alone. Where, Lily wondered, was she going so quickly? What is the meaning of life? That was all. A simple question. One that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one. The highlight. How life, from being made up of little separate incidents, which one lived one by one, became curled and whole like a wave, which bore one up with it and threw one down with it, there with a dash on the beach.
Thank you, Nathan, for that beautiful reading. I think even in hearing and reading this text, there's something about the way it moves that already feels musical, but maybe that's just because it was Nathan reading and not me. But aside from that, the two ideas that sort of emerge from these excerpts is, again, this idea of little moments that accumulate, and how those little moments are then strung together to form wave-like currents. The idea of waves keeps coming back. So now, I'm sure you're all dying to hear some music. So let's take a look at what this might sound like in Schumann. So in the first movement of the Schumann quartet, in looking for something analogous to what one of those waves, or one unit of the wave, one of the little moments might look like, we hear a figure that keeps coming back, that permeates this first movement. Blues. That's our waveform. And this motive is frequently referred to as the Clara motive in reference to Schumann's wife, Clara Schumann. You kind of have the Clara. That's where it gets its name, and you see it all over Schumann's music. So we'll play a passage from this first movement for you where you'll hear that theme, that motive, recurring, but you'll also hear the way small ideas, usually this falling gesture, are sort of strung together through the quartet, and it kind of makes its way through the group, kind of like a wave. Sort of hear the way the waves are formed and the way they string together in that excerpt. There's the sensation of small little units that, when strung together in this way, creates something like a long line. And that is kind of similar to some of these quotes that we've been hearing. Another thing that came up earlier in our discussion was the idea of, as we're moving away from an arc-like structure, we no longer have something that feels like a big climactic moment, that no longer feels like a huge juncture. So we'll now play for you an excerpt from the development section of this movement. And in classical music, the development section of a work is usually where we expect to experience the rising action. We expect a sort of building intensity that ultimately leads somewhere that's monumental and usually has some kind of conflict. But let's see what Schumann does in his development section. that's how it ends. And that's the moment where we return back to material that we've heard before after this point. So we definitely feel the sense of building and building and building. You hear the Clara motif come back, you hear the waves being strung together, and then it builds to nothing. It builds all this energy, and then it sort of dissipates the energy, and the first violin, my part, is sort of left hanging by itself. And we see kind of what we heard in the very first quote that Nathan read, where as this character who's speaking is observing what's happening in this interrelational life, at the end, she's sort of left alone. There's a kind of loneliness about her experiencing the world, when all she's left with is her imagination and her own interiority. And that's sort of what happens here. We don't get the fulfillment of the event that we're building up to. So now, as we move into the second movement, I will call back what I mentioned earlier about the idea of a theme and variations. This is our theme and variations moment, which is a very, very common formal structure in the classical era. So we'll first play for you the theme that Schumann uses, the melody that he uses in this movement that he then develops in variations. It's kind of tragic, beautiful, very vocal, very lyrical and sung. Now, in a typical theme and variations movement, we present a theme like this, and then we go into each of the variations. However, Schumann has the same tendencies that Woolf does, which is he wants to politicize narrative structure. So this is how Schumann actually begins this movement. Very different. Now, if we go back to, well, actually, let's look at some more quotes from To the Lighthouse, actually, to see if this might illuminate why Schumann is choosing to start this way and what that could mean for us. There's a lot of technology involved here today, and I only have two hands.
And she wanted to say not one thing, but everything. Little words that broke up the thought and dismembered it said nothing. About life, about death, about Mrs. Ramsay. No, she thought one could say nothing to nobody. The urgency of the moment always missed its mark. For how could one express in words these emotions of the body? Express that emptiness there? To want and not to have sent all up her body a hardness, a hollowness, a strain. And then to want and not to have, to want and want, how that wrung the heart, that wrung it again and again. The words, she was looking at the window, sounded as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence of themselves. And all the lives we ever lived, and all the lives are to be full of trees and changing leaves. She did not know what they meant, but like music, the words seemed to be spoken by her own voice, outside herself, saying quite easily and naturally what had been in her mind the whole evening while she said different things.
Thank you, Nathan. So we are presented with this desire to express oneself and the tragedy of being confronted with the inability to do so. And I think that maybe in a less dramatic fashion, or maybe in an equally dramatic fashion, is something that we all experience. It's at the core of the human experience is the feeling deeply of something and the struggle to be able to express it in a way that feels authentic, truthful, meaningful, in a way that feels like other people can see and understand what you're trying to say. So what you just heard, the real beginning of this theme and variations movement, or as we like to call it, variations around a theme, is this fragmented, desperately trying to use one's voice version of the theme. The theme is not fully realized yet. It can't be. This is the character, or maybe the music itself, trying to squeeze out its message, but being unable to do so in anything more than these fragmented gasps. So in this movement, much like in Woolf's text, I mean, Lily Briscoe is the character who says this, and she is a painter. She spends this entire book trying to finish this painting and is unable to do so until the very end. And what's happening in this movement is something similar. By going through each of these variations, Schumann is slowly starting to uncover the theme. It's kind of like an archaeology in a way. We're clearing away the dust that makes it difficult for the theme to express itself. So this is what the next variation sounds like. So you hear the sort of growing agitation. Something I actually forgot to mention about that, the very first statement, the very fragmented one that you heard, is the way it resists the feeling of rhythm and pulse. When you hear the version that goes da-da-dum, da-dum, what do you latch onto as a listener? So to demonstrate that, I'm gonna do one version where I play that top line that I have, and Nathan is gonna clap where the strong beats actually are in the bar, just so you can hear how much the music is resisting, and this is part of how it's written, how the music is resisting these beats. So there's this idea, I think, similar to what's happening in a lot of these quotes, where the speaker feels that the thing that's constraining them from being able to express themselves fully is all of these elements of the external world. It's something external to them that's making it difficult to speak their truth. In this case, the music feels that about its rhythm, about the beat. And so in the second variation, which you heard us play just a moment ago, it's fighting against that sort of further and further. So now let's look at what the next variation does. So for the first time, again, you hear the growing intensity of each variation in comparison to the previous one. But we also hear that this is the first variation where notes are in groups of 2 and groups of 4. We hear yada da 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 da. So 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4, as opposed to the previous where it was always groups of 3. So we can also think about this as the music resisting the 3 and trying to find something else, in this case the groupings of 2 or 4, that might make it easier for it to say what it wants to say. And still, it seems to fail. So why don't we play the end of this variation, maybe the second half, into the next variation, where we finally hear the theme that we played for you way at the beginning of this in its fully sung form. Only after the desolation of this variation does it realize what I needed to speak my message truthfully and clearly was actually already within me. It was already within the groups of 3. before we move on to our last segment, before we do the full performance, I just wanted to read the very final sentence of the book, which is from the perspective of Lily, the painter. She says, "It was done, it was finished. Yes," she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, "I have had my vision." Perhaps that's what the theme, once finally arrived at in the version we just played, perhaps that's what that moment is. However, in Schumann's world, it's a little bit different than in Woolf's world, where once we get this theme, the story's not over yet, and there's actually more conflict and more resistance to come. But we will leave that as a surprise for you as you hear the full performance, and I would be delighted to hear what you think that changes about this theme and variation story. So as the final thing we'll share with you is simply what nautical imagery, so imagery of the sea, of the ocean, of the lighthouse, which is an important feature of imagery in this book, what that might sound like in music. And we hear that in the slow movement, in the third movement of this. So Nathan, do you want to read the last few quotes that we have?
"Can't paint, can't write," she murmured monotonously, anxiously considering what her plan of attack should be. For the mass loomed before her. It protruded. She felt it pressing on her eyeballs. Then, as if some juice necessary for the lubrication of her faculties were spontaneously squirted, she began precariously dipping among the blues and the umbers, moving her brush hither and thither. But it was now heavier and went slower, as if it had fallen in with some rhythm which was dictated to her. She kept looking at the hedge, at the canvas, by what she saw, so that while her hand quivered with life, this rhythm was strong enough to bear her along with it on its current. Certainly, she was losing consciousness of outer things, and as she lost consciousness of outer things, and her name and her personality and her appearance and whether Mr. Carmichael was there or not, her mind kept throwing up from its depths scenes and names and sayings and memories and ideas, like a fountain spurting over that glaring, hideously difficult. So the monotonous fall of the waves on the beach, which for the most part beat a measured and soothing tattoo to her thoughts, seemed consolingly to repeat over and over again as she sat with the children the words of some old cradle song murmured by nature. "I am guarding you. I am your support." But at other times, suddenly and unexpectedly, especially when her mind raised itself slightly from the task actually in hand, had no such kindly meaning, but, like a ghostly roll of drums, remorselessly beat the measure of life, made one think of the destruction of the island and its engulfment in the sea, and warned her, whose day had slipped past in one quick doing after another, that it was all ephemeral as a rainbow. This sound, which had been obscured and concealed under the other sounds, suddenly thundered hollow in her ears and made her look up with an impulse of terror.
So here we see nature both as being the calming, comforting thing that exists in the background and the thing that can invoke terror. So we'll play a short excerpt from the slow movement, and you'll see if we can hear both of those in the waves. So now we will play through the entirety of this work. You'll hear 3 movements, excerpts from which you've already heard, and then the final movement, which is really just a joyful celebration and a lot of fun. We do have this idea, the idea of themes and variations that comes back in that last movement, but in a much simpler, more jubilant way. So we hope you enjoy Schumann's Third String Quartet.
Bravo. The Neela String Quartet. Never, ever have I heard such an explanation of the inner life of a person or a work of art using words and music. That was really interesting. And I know we're over time, but if anyone has a question or two for our young musicians. Vibha, also, too, I have to say, it was really a window into your inner life. If this is how you read and think about music, wow, your brain must be exploding all the time. Do we have a question or a comment or anything? Okay.
I'm curious as to which came first, the literature or the music, or how did you put the two together?
Okay, I think there are a number of great ways to do this. For us, basically, we had the opportunity last April, to give a full-length recital together, and this was one of the pieces on our program. And I thought it might be nice, because we had spent such intimate time getting to know this piece, if I could write program notes for a recital that were sort of our own. And as I started writing the program notes, I remember I was in Central Park and I was staring at a blank, like, Google Doc document for about an hour and a half. And I was like, okay, I need to start somewhere. So let me start with what intrigues me most about this piece. And I started talking about the variations around a theme instead of a theme and variations. So the answer is, I started with the music, and as I kept writing about the music, these sort of core philosophical ideas emerged from that. And I thought it might be nice to frame one of those ideas with a quote from literature. And I actually happened to be reading To the Lighthouse at that time, or I just finished it maybe a couple weeks ago. And so there's probably a number of authors and a number of books that I could have chosen to pair with this piece, but it was the idea that was most fresh on my mind. And so I thought it would be a nice thing to pair with and illuminate what we felt about the Schumann.
Terrific. Okay.
This is a question for the cellist. What made you want to use traditional sheet music as opposed to a tablet?
That's such a good question. The sheet music is a relatively recent thing for me. It's pretty simple. I felt looking at a tablet all day, every day, a lot of eye strain. I was noticing headaches. I was noticing that I felt much more fatigued after practice sessions. So I decided to try switching back to paper. And I felt more energy, more steady energy, and I also love printed music, I have to say, and the library is such a perfect place to say this. So I think I'm among friends here. There's something really special and irreplaceable about physical printed material.
Anyone else? Do we have one more? Okay. Oh,
What other pairings do you have in mind for the future?
So we can also send out information about our website where you can see all of this with dates and locations. But coming up, we have Ravel's piano trio with some writing by Clarice Lispector, who's an author I really love and I highly recommend, to talk about how both of those works kind of restructure time, where time isn't linear anymore. Then at the Trenton Library, we have the Neela String Quartet, who is the string quartet in residence at Juilliard. They are phenomenal, we can attest. They will be performing some contemporary, some modern classical music with arrangements of Acadian folk tunes, because they're all from Quebec. And we're pairing that with Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. We're talking about resilience and change and identity and how those things come about. For an Earth Day concert that we're doing in Norfolk, Connecticut, on Earth Day weekend, we are doing an early Haydn quartet with, or sorry, not an early Haydn quartet, one of Haydn's later quartets with Emerson's transcendental poetry and essays to talk about nature as a vehicle into the divine, and also talk about how poetry and poetic forms can inform like the structure of music. So that's some of what's coming up.
okay, last question.
Congratulations, you're all such great musicians. Where do you hope to take your careers after Juilliard?
Anyone else? Blues Janice?
That's a really interesting question, and it's often asked. I guess after graduation, we all have different paths and journeys. For me personally, I'd love to continue pursuing chamber music. It's my love. It's what I do. It's what I want for life. But maybe for like education-wise, I would also love to teach alongside maybe playing in a chamber group. And there are also like different options like playing in an orchestra for more stability. But there are ways to explore.
For me right now, I tend to stop thinking about this. I want to explore all the possibilities to play chamber music, play orchestra, also play solo music, and I want to see where it takes me. So I think keep studying and keep exploring.
I also just want to do a quick plug. Nathan here, one of the many assets that he brings to our group is that he plays a lot of early music and a lot of fiddle music, and can I ask you to demonstrate your chop? He has the most extraordinary chopping techniques, and every time we meet him, he has like cultivated a new one. And this is just to show that it's also great that at Juilliard we get to do a lot of different kinds of playing, and he's an exemplar of that.
I've never tried this with this bow before.
Nice. So that's to say we're all doing lots of different kinds of things, which is a lot of fun.
So I think for my answer to this question, as long as life has great people and great music, and those two things are working together, I'd say I will be happy. And oftentimes that leads me to chamber music. And I've said to people in answer to this question, if I got to spend the rest of my life playing Haydn string quartets, I would die happy. Just something about being in this role as a cellist, supporting a group, is so deeply fulfilling. So looking for ways to, do that that's supported financially as well often includes teaching or being tied to different organizations, ensembles. So in terms of what the future looks like practically, I'm keeping an open mind, just seeing where life leads, and I see definitely more education in the future as well.
How about you, Vibha?
Yeah, I echo everything else that's been said. Teaching has been a big love of mine, particularly because I feel indebted to the teachers that I've had. I've been blessed with phenomenal mentors at every turn. I think we can all say that. I mean, in my view, everything that you've seen today is a product of the people who have had faith in us and gave so much time and care for us. And so I think it's a duty and a very exciting thing for us to do that in turn for young people, or younger people. But definitely chamber music is the heart of everything for us, because there's a kind of intimacy, a shared connection here that is, you can't surpass that. So hopefully a mix of all those things. I don't believe in having to choose one thing and follow it. I think we can do it all. I think we can have it all. And so for me, that means literature and philosophy and math and this kind of playing and orchestral playing. It can all happen. And so hopefully that's what the future looks like.
Well, we hope you'll come back to New Canaan. And friends, if you'd like to keep track of narrative resonance, go to our calendar. Their information is on the registration page, and it's linked. So you can just click on, you can follow them on Instagram. Thank you so much. And thank you. You were a great audience. Safe home, everyone. Thank you. Neela String Quartet.